Please join me in welcoming Karl Sharman and Piotr Wojtyła.
Well done.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you to my mic. There, is that better? There we go. Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a privilege to be here and presenting at ATT&CKcon. Thank you very much to Katie for the introduction and to the ATT&CK team for having us here. I'm Karl, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Piotr. We are from CrowdStrike. We are members of the CrowdStrike Overwatch threat hunting team. Overwatch is our threat hunting service. And on the Overwatch team, we have been using ATT&CK for a few years now, and it's been great for us. And what we'd like to talk with you about today is how, in particular, over just this past year, we've made some significant enhancements and improvements to how we are implementing ATT&CK into our threat hunting processes. But first, a quick word on our backgrounds. I started my career in government, doing the military and intelligence community thing, and I've now been at CrowdStrike for over 4 years, and I've been on our Overwatch threat hunting team for that entire time. I also still serve in a part-time capacity in the Air National Guard. I'm the Director of Operations for a Cyber Intelligence Squadron up in Washington State. So I know a few speakers already today have talked about ways that you can serve and give back, like being an adjunct professor and teaching. Well, of course, serving in the reserve component is another way to give back to the community. And as a National Guardsman, I'm obligated to be a shameless recruiter. So if anybody is interested in serving, giving back in that capacity, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that during one of the breaks.
Hello. Yeah, cool. Hey everyone, it's great to be here. My name is Piotr Wojtyła, and I've been previously involved mostly in incident response, but now with our threat hunting and Overwatch team, more in a research position, so I don't really know what I do. I just do different things that they ask of me.
All right, so our agenda for today, we are going to talk to you about attacking the hard way. That is the way that we were doing it before this year, which had some challenges that we'll talk about. And then I'll talk about the ways that we have made some improvements to that. And now we're implementing ATT&CK in a much easier way, you could say. And then we'll wrap up with talking about some interesting TTPs we've seen in the wild over the first half of this year, which sharing those examples we think helps validate the successes we've had in these improvements and how we've been implementing ATT&CK here more recently. Also, a few other notes I should mention is when we refer to specific adversaries, of course, as has been mentioned several times today, there's different naming conventions, right? We use that CrowdStrike naming convention, which is the national animal theme. So when we say a panda, that's a Chinese adversary, and when we say a Chilima, that's a North Korean adversary. Bears are Russian, and so on. And then if we say spiders, that's referring to a criminal adversary. So sometimes we throw those things out without just somewhat naturally, but that's what we're referring to. And one other note as we get started here is that the content we're sharing today, these interesting findings, the valuable work that's been uncovered, that has led to significant findings from our threat hunting operations, is the result of an entire team of Overwatch threat hunters. Piotr and I can't take all the credit for what is being shared today. They're the ones who deserve that credit. We have a great team of very skilled and experienced hunters that we're grateful for, and so this is very much a team effort that's resulted in this presentation. Okay, attacking the hard way. How were we implementing and using ATT&CK prior to this year? Well, it was a challenge in the sense that it was laborious. We got a lot of value out of using ATT&CK. ATT&CK has given us some great improvements overall in our threat hunting service that we provide for customers because it's allowed us to standardize and more clearly communicate our threat findings to customers. It's allowed us, from an intelligence perspective, to more effectively and accurately track adversary trends over time. That's all been really good stuff. And as far as how we've gone about using ATT&CK in the past, more specifically, what we do is when we identify targeted intrusions, we go back and we review all of the data and manually map that back to attack techniques. And we leverage all data sources we have access to. So primarily that's our Falcon endpoint product. We have endpoint event data that comes into our cloud, and we can partition off the portions of that activity that's relevant to a targeted intrusion and map that. We also rely upon any forensics data that our services, incident response teams can pull back for us for relevant intrusions as well. And then if there are samples from the activity that our intelligence team can get a hold of and reverse and do some binary analysis on, we'll pull that in as well. So any and every resource we can, we pull that in and then map that manually by going through that data as human analysts and identifying when certain techniques are employed and manually map that back to particular techniques. Now, when we have done that mapping, both prior to this year and still this year, we're only doing that for targeted intrusions, and that is those state-sponsored or even criminally motivated targeted actors who are going after specific organizations. Oftentimes that's interactive, hands-on keyboard type of activity. We're not targeting the more common, low-level, noisy, commodity-type malware threats that is also seen often out there in the wild. These are those targeted adversaries that we're taking the time to map. But even still, given the fact that we're analyzing new targeted intrusion activity on a daily basis, like this is a laborious process when you're having to do all of this manually. Hence the illustration here of Sisyphus constantly pushing that rock up the hill. It seemed like we were constantly overwhelmed and having a difficult time keeping up doing this in a very manual process. So we've made some changes this year. And we decided, hey, we need to automate some of this, at least as much as possible, at least as much that makes sense. And some of that automation was motivated by some of the presentations given last year at ATT&CKcon, where there were some presenters who talked about the pros and cons of automating attack technique mapping. So we decided, yeah, we're going to give that a shot this year. What are some ways we can do that? And so that's taken a few different forms for us. First and foremost, we have taken advantage of our own product itself, so the Falcon Endpoint product that we use for a lot of our hunting. In and of itself, it already is looking for specific malicious behaviors, and those behaviors, when they are fired, when they're triggered as detections in the product, those detections are already mapped to the most likely, most common attack technique for that type of behavior. So hey, that's a resource we can take advantage of to help automatically populate these technique mappings for targeted intrusions, because those targeted intrusions are going to oftentimes trigger at least some of those detections within that product itself. So that's good. We can take advantage of that. Also, as a threat hunting team, there's a lot more beyond our product detections of behaviors that we are looking for, a lot more experimental hunting leads that similarly can, to an extent, be mapped in advance to a most common, a most likely attack technique associated with that behavior. So hey, there's another whole batch of resources we can take into account. So using some of those types of capabilities, we scripted up some capabilities that allow us then to take a set of targeted intrusion data and run it through that scripting engine and output for us automated mapped techniques for that particular targeted intrusion, which is great. So here you see a very stripped down version of the output from that automated mapping that we do. Some of the fields are eliminated, but the most relevant key pieces here is what we're honing in on here for focus. So in that first column, you've got the technique that's been mapped, and then of course the timestamp, and then the associated command line activity for the behavior that was auto-mapped, if you will. So we'll look at that first line briefly up here in the process injection technique mapping. So what's happening there is in that search protocol host process, a Cobalt Strike implant has been injected into that process and is acting as that malicious implant. Therefore, oh yeah, process injection is making sense. And I should say too that this is a real world example from earlier this year. This was a criminally motivated targeted intrusion against a financial sector institution. And so yeah, this is all from that same intrusion, real world data. And the next technique, if you go next down the line, you see there's masquerading that has been mapped to a similar search protocol host process. Now, what's happening here is this flagged on a particular behavior that was pre-mapped, that we mapped to masquerading because it's looking for unusual execution of search protocol host. Essentially, when search protocol host is executed normally, it's going to have additional command line arguments with it. So when it's executed in this fashion, there's no additional command line arguments. Something weird's going on. We typically would think that that's maybe some other piece of malware that's trying to masquerade as search protocol host. Well, what's really happening here is that search protocol host is what is actually running here. This is legit search protocol host, but it's it's behaving, it's executing in a strange fashion because of that cobalt strike activity I mentioned earlier that had been mapped previously to process injection. So for masquerading, it's not a true mapping. It's not a very accurate automated mapping, because that's not the type of masquerading that we were looking for when we originally created the map from that pattern to the technique of masquerading. So this right then and there shows you some of the limitations that come with automating attack technique mapping, at least in this fashion. So that would be an example of something we'd filter out from our final results and have to go through. So even here, even still with this automation happening, you still need that human analyst in the loop to go through and verify accuracy, validate those findings to make sure that the automated mapping is correct. Continuing down the line, command line interface, that's pretty self-explanatory. The adversary was using a command shell for some of their operations. Next, you'll see a couple techniques listed as sensor-based ML. Of course, we recognize that that's not an official attack technique. That's an internal naming convention that we use just because there are a couple pieces of malware as part of this attack that were executed that triggered our next-gen AV machine learning algorithms that were identified. And since that malware in that generic sense doesn't really, it's too difficult to map it to a single technique, we just have that placeholder as sensor-based machine learning there. So that's what's happening in those two lines of results. And then the final result, you see Windows admin shares was automatically mapped to the behavior in that last final large command line here. And what's happening in that behavior, what the pattern was that triggered on that was a pattern looking for SMB exec. Many of you are probably familiar with SMB exec. It's that open source tool that acts like PS exec, essentially allows adversaries, we see targeted adversaries use it from time to time. They use that to perform execution of malicious activity on remote hosts. So because of that remote behavior, we auto pre-mapped that to Windows shares because it often uses Windows shares to perform that execution on the remote hosts. But you can see here, this is, there's something different happening here. This actually is the SMB exec tool used in this intrusion. And there's a lot happening there. I don't have time to go into all the details, but essentially what it's doing is it's actually executing on local hosts. It's not reaching out over the network to perform its malicious activity. Therefore, again, this is another case where even it's a true positive hit of something malicious happening, the pattern being mapped to Windows shares doesn't really match. That's not a correct mapping per se. This is yet another example of something that we would need to filter out of our results, and we wouldn't necessarily say that this is Windows shares in this example, in this case. But there's probably other techniques. So the other part here is auto mapping is only going to get you so far. You need a human in the loop to verify, validate the accuracy of the findings, and you still have to go through all the event data because not everything in the intrusion necessarily is going to be detected by some of our pre-mapped capabilities. So there's still somewhat of a manual element to it, but automating gives us a jump start. It closes the gap. It gives us a head start in mapping the entire intrusion to attack.
Cool. Carl gave us an overview of our journey since last year. So kind of to summarize that, we take findings from different investigations, incident response, threat intelligence, threat hunting, intrusions. We map that based on the attack framework, and then we create observables, or what we call observables. So examples of how that specific technique was used by the adversaries. So it kind of begs the question, what do we do with that data next? So the first thing we do is we create a tactical threat profiles for the adversaries that allows us to pivot based on the data that we mapped. As an example, I want to know every single credential access technique done by Wicked Panda, how that's stuck against every credential access technique done by Fancy Bear, and look for similarities, look for things that might be interesting. Another thing that we do is we take those threat actor profiles and we apply that knowledge across our customers, across different verticals, and try to track campaigns across our customer base, track and enrich campaigns across our customer base. So as an example, earlier this year, we had an intrusion. We had a same threat actor, Wicked Panda, that was who targeted different customers across multiple verticals. And among many different techniques, we saw one behavioral technique that was very, very similar. Basically, they renamed Mimikatz and execute that renamed version of Mimikatz, but the name of the Mimikatz would be a three-letter name of the customer they were after, and that would be, on different customers. It wasn't the only thing that was specific to the adversary. It was just one of those kind of behavioral, tactical things that we looked at. I was like, okay, that's very similar to something else we've seen that was also associated with that actor based on implants, based on infrastructure, things like that. The bottom line is that we can use those threat actor profiles based on the observables that we created to kind of track different campaigns across our customer base. And what we do with that data is we create the final deliverables, or we create our reporting that we share both with our customers and with the community as part of our half-year and yearly reports.
And that is something, too, that you're seeing an example of here is, when we are completed with all of our analysis, that's done all the mapping, we can deliver that, and we do deliver that even publicly at times. So our annual and mid-year Overwatch threat hunting reports are something that's published publicly, and we've got it mapped with the detail that's been facilitated by our automated process, filled in still with some manual process, but you get an end result like what you see here. This is just an example. This isn't necessarily from the same intrusion we were talking about before, but this is just a couple different examples of what that final product looks like. And speaking of our annual and mid-year reporting, we actually just released our mid-year report, which again covers our threat hunting findings for the first half of the year. So if you just Google 2019 CrowdStrike Overwatch mid-year report, you can pull down a copy of that. And it provides not just specific examples like what was in the previous slide, but we even also provide, as best we can, the overall review of all the techniques that we've mapped over that given time period and all the targeted intrusion activity that we've seen. It's delivered in this heat map view. And so we encourage you to take a look at that if you do want to dive into some of those additional details. There are a few of these examples. Of course, sometimes we see some techniques a lot, but every now and then we see some techniques used in a particularly unique fashion. And so there's a few examples now as we continue with the presentation that we'll dive into of a few interesting technique implementations seen in targeted intrusions in the wild. The tactics highlighted in green here are the tactics we'll share a few examples from. We don't have time. For time's sake, we're limited. We can't share an example from each of the tactic families, but these are the ones we'll dive into now. Okay, so interesting TTPs in the wild. We will start with an intrusion that occurred against an academic institution where the victim organization suspected that something was going on their network. They called in our services team to go in and do incident response, and we as threat hunters in Overwatch then partnered with our on-ground incident responders to work together to help uncover potential evidence of an adversary there. And sure enough, it didn't take too long for us to find evidence of targeted activity. It looked like Velvet Chalima was on the network. And it turns out, sure enough, further analysis confirmed that and verified this was actually part of that larger stolen pencil campaign that was reported publicly and widely earlier this past year. And in this case, this is one of those institutions. The North Koreans were actively targeting a number of Western-based academic institutions. So that's what this intrusion was all about. And among the artifacts that we had uncovered pretty early on in the course of the analysis was an implant that our intelligence team calls Gold Stamp. And the Gold Stamp implant has a number of different collection tactic capabilities. It is primarily a keylogger, but it can do some other things, including an interesting twist on the clipboard data technique. So what this implant's able to do is identify when a cryptocurrency wallet address is saved to the clipboard, it will replace that clipboard saved wallet address with a wallet address that's owned by Velvet Chalima. Therefore, when crypto transfer activity happens, that cryptocurrency will be transferred to a Velvet Chalima controlled account. Similarly, we'll stay with the same intrusion here because there's a lot of interesting dynamics involved in this particular intrusion. A lot of it was reported publicly, but there's some other interesting aspects to it that we wanted to highlight that wasn't talked about as much in the public. So something that happened early on in this intrusion, the adversary had gained access and had entrenched themselves pretty effectively throughout the network before we got there and before we had visibility. And during that time, they were able to dump credentials and gather a number of valid accounts. And unfortunately, for at least one particular user on this academic network, they had reused the same credentials for their academic network account as they did for some other personal services and accounts, including PayPal and Gmail. So unfortunately, the Velvet Chalima adversaries were able to commandeer his PayPal and Gmail accounts. And they used that to to take their browser extensions technique to a whole new level, if you will. So essentially what they did is they used this individual's legitimate Gmail account to go into the Google Chrome web store, and they posted their browser extension, their malicious browser extension, to the Google Chrome web store, and used this guy's Gmail account to comment about how great this Google Chrome extension is and how everybody should download it. It gives you these great custom font capabilities. And it turns out, and actually they're just trying to further infect more potential victims, and obviously having a legitimate Gmail account that's commenting on the browser extension would pique interest and shows you just the level of creativity that our adversaries will go to. But there you have it, an interesting, crafty implementation of the browser extensions technique.
Another one from one of our customers in the telecom vertical. This time it was on, actually the adversary targeted the Linux part of their estate. And the adversary used the combination of valid accounts, SSH to log in to perform some basic hosted network reconnaissance, reviewed some shell history, tried to identify systems and accounts, and systems that they could log in, accounts that they could use to log into those systems, things like that. But the key thing that I want to talk about in this case is the fact that they modified system binaries. So instead of trying to drop a rootkit that would hide the activity specific to the processes or the network traffic related to the threat actor, they actually replaced tools, administrative tools on the system. So they recompiled the tools on a box, things like PS, things like TOP, things like netstat. Any tool that the administrator might use or user might use would basically have its new version with an extra code, and that code actually checked every time the command would be executed. The tool would first check the directory that was on the system, and in that directory there will be an information about network, about processes, and about files that will be redacted from the output from that tool. And that way the adversary would basically be able to hide on the system from anyone who was trying to investigate. Obviously the functionality is similar in a way to rootkits, but they decided not to drop specific rootkit implant, but instead replace tools with additional functionality. As you can see on the slide, the snippet of that activity, the adversary basically removed the PS file and then recompiled their own version of PS and left it on the system. Moving on to another example, the same adversary, the same intrusion. This time, in addition to the threat actor modifying binaries that allow them to hide from potential administrators and potential incident responders trying to investigate that activity, they've also modified SSH in a way they could maintain access to the system as well as collect additional credentials. So that modified SSH binary would actually change the of password function within the SSH that is responsible for validating user logons. And that modification basically allowed them to provide the same password, the same static password that will allow them to log into the system every single time, as well as collect any legitimate user logon, username and password, and save it into a file. That way they could then access those credentials and potentially reuse it somewhere else on the network. Another story, another intrusion, another story. This time, one of the adversaries targeting a software company, basically the threat actor used interactive logon to execute a bash script that automated a multi-stage execution process. Couple of droppers, couple of downloaders. The end result of that multi-stage execution chain were two files that were created on the system. One of them was .inf file. That is the profile for the connection manager. That INF file was an actual implant, and the threat actor executed the connection manager service to install that profile on the system, leading to the installation of the malicious implant. We usually see the connection manager being used by the e-crime teams, but in this particular case, we suspected it was the targeted adversary most likely one of the pandas, and kind of getting back to when I talked about threat profiles and how we create those tactical threat profiles. Unfortunately, our threat intelligence team didn't have enough information to attribute that activity based on the data that was available at that time. But based on that behavioral and tactical level of information that we're able to gather with, based on our observables, based on the profiles that we created, we're able to look at similar activity of that specific panda and other behavioral techniques. And it's very likely that in this case it was actually the targeted adversary, just based on the back of that research and observables that we did. So it kind of allows us to apply that threat profile to identify the threat actor, and then use that knowledge to find other activity specific to the actor within the network. All right. Next one is also specific to an adversary who targeted this time a defense industrial based company. In this particular case, the threat actor, we were asked, both the incident response team, the threat intelligence team, and our threat hunting team were asked to help out. It was a pre-existing intrusion, so we rolled into the environment where the threat actor was already well established, and we've seen the threat actor using valid accounts with scheduled tasks with ATT&CK to execute and move laterally on the network. But one of the most interesting findings during that intrusion was a custom tool that they used to steal and manipulate tokens, in memory, that allowed them to impersonate any user on a system. So that tool, and you can see example of the execution of that tool, basically works as run as on a Windows system. You provide a username you want to impersonate, the tool you want to execute, and that magically happens through the token impersonation, in-memory token impersonation on the system.
Yeah, and it's awfully kind of the adversary too to name their tool after what technique they were actually using there, token exe. Even APT sometimes takes shortcuts. Cool. Okay, the last example here that we'll share comes from a case of big game hunting. When we say big game hunting, what we're referring to are those targeted ransomware attacks where a criminal adversary will go after an organization of various sizes. This example here is from a large international conglomerate organization that was targeted, but it could be an organization of any size with that targeted ransomware attack. And this has gained a lot of popularity in recent months, of course, with small organizations like municipal governments or public school districts, things like that, being targeted with this ransomware, where an adversary goes after a particular organization, tries to spread that ransomware as widely as possible to lock down that network and hold it for ransom. We do see this type of activity quite often, and the most common types of ransomware employed in the big game hunting operations that we uncover when we do our threat hunting are typically Ryuk or Defray or Phobos or Dharma. And this one was one of the Dharma cases. Dharma is somewhat interesting in that, according to our intelligence findings, our intelligence team, they assess that Dharma may have some level of control there, but it's widely deployed by a number of different affiliates who use that Dharma ransomware. Even though a number of different affiliates may be using it to target various different organizations, we still see quite a bit of overlap in TTPs utilized in the course of those big game hunting attacks that use Dharma. Some of those common TTPs are RDP brute forcing, RDP password spraying to gain initial access into the environment. Then they'll almost always deploy the same network share scanning tool to identify potential network shares where they could spread their ransomware tool to. They also really like to use different open source, openly available tools that allow them to disable security products on those endpoints, so things like Process Hacker, PC Hunter. So anyways, you see a lot of these common overlaps. And we did see a lot of those behaviors in this particular attack, but this attack added something that we hadn't seen from the other Dharma big game hunting campaigns, and that is some modifications to the registry that were unusual, some of those system setting changes. So what they did is they ran a command that led to that registry change that you see there, where they essentially changed the RDP settings to disable timeout. And the reason we suspect they did this is because when they land on the network, on their beachhead with that RDP access, it could take them some time to ultimately achieve their ultimate goals. And they don't want to lose that exact session access in the middle of that. It could take them, as we've seen, as many evidence of hours, even days, for them to move around, escalate privileges, move laterally to effectively spread the ransomware to lock down the network. So they want to make sure they have enough time to do that. So they modify the registry to make sure that their RDP session wouldn't time out. And that concludes our presentation. We are grateful again for the chance and happy to take any questions. If we're out of time, I'm happy to take them offline during break as well. Thank you.
I think we're just at time. Perfect. Thank you so much.